Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome to an exploration of Islam in Indonesia, the world's largest Muslim-majority nation. In this comprehensive overview, we'll delve into the fascinating history, demographics, daily life, challenges, and social dynamics of Muslims in this diverse archipelago. Our journey begins with the arrival of Islam in Indonesia, tracing its peaceful spread through trade and cultural exchange. We'll then examine the current Muslim population, breaking down the numbers and looking at the distribution of different Islamic traditions. From there, we'll paint a picture of daily life for Indonesian Muslims, exploring their practices, customs, and geographical distribution across the country. We'll also confront the challenges facing this community, from religious conservatism to economic issues. Finally, we'll tackle the complex topic of religious intolerance in Indonesia, examining whether Islamophobia exists in this Muslim-majority nation and how religious tensions manifest in unique ways. Through this exploration, we aim to provide a nuanced understanding of Islam's role in shaping Indonesia's past, present, and future. Let's begin our journey through the rich tapestry of Indonesian Islam. The story of Islam in Indonesia begins over 1,000 years ago. It's a tale of trade, cultural exchange, and gradual transformation that shaped the archipelago we know today. Islam first reached Indonesian shores through Arab and Indian traders in the 13th century. These merchants, sailing the busy maritime routes between the Middle East, India, and Southeast Asia, brought not just goods, but also their faith to the region. The process was remarkably peaceful and gradual, unlike the sometimes forceful spread of Islam in other parts of the world. Initially, Islam gained a foothold in coastal trading ports. Cities like Pasai in northern Sumatra became early centers of Islamic learning and culture. From there, the religion spread slowly inland, often through the conversion of local rulers who saw political and economic advantages in adopting the faith of their trading partners. What's fascinating is how Islam adapted to and blended with existing Indonesian traditions. Prior to Islam, the archipelago was dominated by Hindu and Buddhist kingdoms, with animist beliefs also widely practiced. Rather than completely displacing these traditions, Islam often incorporated elements of them, creating a unique syncretic form of the religion. This process was aided by Sufi mystics, who played a crucial role in spreading Islam throughout Indonesia. Their emphasis on spiritual experience rather than strict doctrine made Islam more accessible to local populations. They often presented Islam as a continuation or fulfillment of existing beliefs rather than a complete replacement. The establishment of Islamic kingdoms marked a significant turning point. The Sultanate of Malacca, founded in the early 15th century, became a major center of Islamic culture and learning. Its influence spread throughout the Malay archipelago, accelerating the Islamization process. In Java, the Wali Songo, or Nine Saints, are credited with spreading Islam in the 15th and 16th centuries. These revered figures used various methods to introduce Islamic teachings, including through traditional Javanese art forms like wayang, shadow puppet theater, and gamelan music. By the 16th century, Islam had become the dominant religion in many parts of Indonesia, particularly in Java and Sumatra. However, the process of Islamization continued well into the 19th and even 20th centuries in some remote areas. It's important to note that this spread wasn't uniform across the archipelago. Some regions, like Bali, remained predominantly Hindu, while others, like parts of eastern Indonesia, later became Christian due to European missionary activity. The arrival of European colonizers, particularly the Dutch, added another layer of complexity to Indonesia's religious landscape. While they didn't actively promote Christianity, their presence sometimes led to a strengthening of Islamic identity as a form of resistance to colonial rule. This long and complex history has resulted in the diverse forms of Islam we see in Indonesia today. From the more orthodox practices in Aceh to the syncretic traditions of Javanese Islam, the religion in Indonesia reflects the unique journey of its arrival and adaptation in the archipelago. It's a testament to the flexibility of both Islam and Indonesian culture, creating a religious landscape that's truly unique in the Islamic world. All right, let's dive deeper into the numbers and demographics of Muslims in Indonesia. This is really fascinating stuff because Indonesia has the largest Muslim population of any country in the world, which often surprises people who might think of Middle Eastern countries first when they think of Islam. According to the most recent comprehensive surveys and census data, about 87% of Indonesia's population identifies as Muslim. Now, Indonesia's total population is around 270 million people, so we're talking about roughly 230 million Muslims. That's a huge number, more than the entire populations of most countries. Breaking this down further, the vast majority of Indonesian Muslims, we're talking about 99%, are Sunni Muslims. They primarily follow the Shafi'i school of jurisprudence, which is one of the 4 major Sunni schools of Islamic law. This Shafi'i tradition has been dominant in Southeast Asia for centuries and has played a big role in shaping how Islam is practiced in Indonesia. Now, when it comes to Shia Muslims, they're a very small minority in Indonesia. We're looking at less than 1% of the Muslim population, which translates to maybe a few 100,000 people at most. There are some Shia communities scattered around the country, particularly in Jakarta and some parts of East Java, but they're definitely not a significant presence numerically. It's worth noting that within the Sunni majority, there's a lot of diversity. You've got organizations like Nahdlatul Ulama and Muhammadiyah, which are the 2 largest Muslim organizations in Indonesia. Nahdlatul Ulama is known for promoting a more traditional, syncretic form of Islam that incorporates local Indonesian customs, while Muhammadiyah tends to advocate for a more modernist interpretation. There are also smaller Muslim groups in Indonesia, like the Ahmadiyya community. They're not considered part of mainstream Islam by many Muslims, and they face some discrimination, but they're present in small numbers. What's really interesting is how these numbers have changed over time. The percentage of Muslims in Indonesia has actually increased slightly over the past few decades. This is partly due to higher birth rates among Muslim communities, but also because of some conversion from other religions. It's also important to note that these numbers can vary quite a bit depending on which part of Indonesia you're looking at. In some provinces, like Aceh in northern Sumatra, the Muslim population is close to 100%. In others, like Bali or parts of eastern Indonesia, the percentage is much lower. Another interesting aspect is the urban-rural divide. While Muslims are the majority pretty much everywhere in Indonesia, you tend to see more religious diversity in big cities like Jakarta or Surabaya. Rural areas, especially in Java and Sumatra, tend to be more uniformly Muslim. So when we talk about Muslims in Indonesia, we're really talking about a huge, diverse group that makes up the majority of the world's 4th most populous country. It's a community that's continuing to grow and evolve, shaping Indonesia's culture, politics, and society in profound ways. Let's dive into the daily lives of Muslims in Indonesia. It's a fascinating mix of religious devotion, cultural traditions, and modern life that really shows how Islam has become woven into the fabric of Indonesian society. For many Indonesian Muslims, the day starts early with the dawn prayer, Fajr. You'll hear the call to prayer, or adhan, ringing out from mosques across cities and villages. After prayer, people might read the Quran or just start their day. During the work week, many then head off to their jobs or studies. Throughout the day, devout Muslims will pause for the remaining 4 daily prayers. In many workplaces and public spaces, you'll find mushola, small prayer rooms, to make this easier. It's common to see people carrying prayer mats with them, ready to pray wherever they are when the time comes. Friday is a particularly important day. Many Muslim men attend the congregational Friday prayer at mosques. In some areas, you'll see streets filled with worshipers if the mosque is overflowing. Women can attend too, but it's not obligatory for them. Eating habits are influenced by Islamic dietary laws. Most food in Indonesia is halal, and in many areas it can be hard to find non-halal options. During Ramadan, the holy month of fasting, the rhythm of life changes dramatically. Muslims fast from dawn to sunset, and cities come alive at night with special meals and prayers. Islamic values influence clothing too, especially for women. While there's a wide range of interpretations, many Muslim women in Indonesia wear some form of hijab or head covering. In more conservative areas like Aceh, you'll see stricter adherence to Islamic dress codes. Islamic education is a big part of life for many. Kids often attend madrasah, Islamic schools, in addition to or instead of secular schools. There's also a tradition of pesantren, Islamic boarding schools, which play a big role in educating young Muslims. Now, when it comes to where Muslims live, you'll find them all over Indonesia, but there are some concentrations. The island of Java, which includes major cities like Jakarta and Surabaya, has the largest Muslim population. Sumatra, especially provinces like Aceh, is also heavily Muslim. In fact, Aceh is the only province in Indonesia that officially implements Sharia law. In contrast, you'll find fewer Muslims in places like Bali, which is predominantly Hindu, or parts of eastern Indonesia like Papua, where Christianity is more common. But even in these areas, there are significant Muslim communities. Urban areas tend to have a more diverse mix of religious practices. In a city like Jakarta, you might see women in full niqab walking alongside others in Western-style clothing. Rural areas, especially in Java and Sumatra, often have a more homogeneous and traditional Islamic culture. Islamic holidays are major events in Indonesia. Eid al-Fitr, marking the end of Ramadan, is probably the biggest celebration of the year. You'll see massive prayer gatherings, family reunions, and a lot of festive food. Eid al-Adha, the Feast of Sacrifice, is another important holiday where many Muslims participate in ritual animal sacrifice and distribute meat to the poor. There's also a uniquely Indonesian tradition called Mudik, where millions of people return to their hometowns for Eid al-Fitr. It's one of the largest temporary human migrations in the world and really shows how important family and tradition are in Indonesian Islamic culture. So in essence, Islam in Indonesia isn't just a religion. It's a way of life that influences everything from daily routines to major life events, all while blending with local traditions and adapting to modern life. It's this unique mix that makes Indonesian Islam so fascinating to observe and study. All right, let's delve into the challenges faced by the Muslim population in Indonesia. Like any large and diverse community, Indonesian Muslims grapple with a range of issues that reflect both internal tensions and external pressures. One of the biggest challenges is the ongoing debate about the role of Islam in public life and politics. Indonesia is officially a secular state, but there's constant tension between those who want a greater role for Islamic law and those who want to maintain a clear separation of religion and state. This plays out in debates over things like local Sharia-inspired bylaws, Islamic banking regulations, and even dress codes in some areas. There's also a growing concern about religious conservatism and radicalization. While the vast majority of Indonesian Muslims practice a moderate form of Islam, there's been a noticeable shift towards more conservative interpretations in recent years. This is partly influenced by increased connections with the Middle East, including more Indonesians studying in countries like Saudi Arabia and bringing back stricter interpretations of Islam. This trend towards conservatism has led to increased pressure on religious minorities, including Muslim minority sects like the Ahmadiyya and Shia communities. These groups often face discrimination and sometimes even violence. It's a real challenge for Indonesia's tradition of religious tolerance and pluralism. Economic inequality is another significant issue. While Indonesia's economy has been growing, the benefits haven't been equally distributed. Many Muslims, especially in rural areas, still struggle with poverty. This economic disparity can fuel resentment and sometimes gets framed in religious terms, even though it's more of a socio-economic issue. Education is a complex challenge. On one hand, there's a strong tradition of Islamic education in Indonesia, with many respected Islamic schools and universities. On the other hand, some worry that certain Islamic schools, particularly more conservative ones, might not be equipping students with the skills they need for the modern job market. There's also the challenge of balancing traditional Islamic values with the pressures of globalization and modernization. This plays out in debates over things like gender roles, with more conservative elements pushing back against women's increasing participation in public life and the workforce. Interfaith relations can be tense at times. While Indonesia has a long history of religious tolerance, there have been instances of conflict between Muslims and Christians in places like Maluku and central Sulawesi. Managing these tensions and promoting interfaith harmony remains an ongoing challenge. Corruption is a widespread problem in Indonesia, and religious institutions aren't immune. There have been scandals involving mismanagement of zakat, obligatory charitable donations, funds, and other religious endowments. This erodes trust in religious leadership and institutions. Environmental issues are becoming increasingly important. Indonesia is on the front lines of climate change, facing rising sea levels and extreme weather events. There's a growing movement to frame environmental protection in Islamic terms, but it's still a challenge to mobilize widespread action. Lastly, there's the ongoing issue of how to interpret and apply Islamic teachings in a rapidly changing world. This includes debates over things like Islamic finance, halal certification for new products and technologies, and how to approach issues like LGBTQ+ rights from an Islamic perspective. All these challenges reflect the complex reality of being the world's largest Muslim-majority country in the 21st century. Indonesian Muslims are constantly negotiating between their religious identity, national identity, and the pressures of the modern world. It's a dynamic process that shapes not just Indonesia, but has implications for the global Muslim community as a whole. Let's dive into the topic of Islamophobia in Indonesia. This is a complex issue because Indonesia is a Muslim-majority country, which creates a different dynamic compared to Islamophobia in Western nations. First off, it's important to note that Islamophobia, in the traditional sense, fear or hatred of Islam and Muslims, isn't a widespread phenomenon in Indonesia. With Muslims making up about 87% of the population, they're the dominant religious group, not a minority facing systemic discrimination. However, there are some nuanced issues that we can discuss. While there aren't significant Islamophobic organizations in Indonesia, there are tensions and discrimination that affect certain Muslim groups and intersect with broader issues of religious intolerance. There's also been growing concern about the influence of more hardline or fundamentalist interpretations of Islam. This has led to some pushback from more moderate Muslims and non-Muslims who worry about the impact on Indonesia's traditionally pluralistic society. This tension sometimes gets framed as a conflict between Indonesian Islam and foreign, more conservative influences. In terms of organizations fighting against Islam, again, this isn't really a thing in Indonesia, given the Muslim majority. However, there are groups that advocate for a secular state and resist attempts to implement Sharia law more broadly. These groups aren't anti-Islam per se, but they do oppose what they see as the Islamization of politics and public life. Interestingly, there have been cases where Indonesian Muslims have raised concerns about what they perceive as Islamophobia in other countries, particularly in the West. This has sometimes led to protests or calls for boycotts of countries or products seen as anti-Muslim. It's also worth noting that there's a complex relationship between religion and ethnicity in Indonesia. Sometimes what might appear to be religious tension is actually rooted in ethnic or regional conflicts. For example, tensions between Muslims and Christians in some areas are often as much about local political power and resources as they are about religion. In recent years, there's been growing awareness of the need to combat all forms of religious intolerance, including discrimination against Muslim minorities. Civil society organizations and moderate Muslim groups often lead these efforts, promoting interfaith dialogue and advocating for the rights of all religious communities. The Indonesian government has also taken steps to address religious intolerance, though critics argue these efforts aren't always effective. There are laws against blasphemy and religious defamation, which are ostensibly meant to protect all religions but have sometimes been used to target religious minorities, including minority Muslim groups. In education, there are ongoing efforts to promote religious tolerance and pluralism. This includes revising textbooks to better reflect Indonesia's diversity and implementing programs to teach students about different religions. So while Islamophobia in the traditional sense isn't a major issue in Indonesia, there are complex dynamics around religious tolerance, the role of Islam in public life, and the treatment of minority Muslim groups. These issues continue to shape Indonesia's social and political landscape, reflecting the challenges of maintaining unity and pluralism in one of the world's most diverse nations. As we wrap up our exploration of Islam in Indonesia, I hope you've gained a deeper understanding of this fascinating and complex topic. From its rich history and diverse practices to the challenges and dynamics shaping its future, Islam in Indonesia offers a unique window into the world's largest Muslim population. If you found this video informative and engaging, I'd love for you to be a part of our growing community. Hit that subscribe button to stay updated on more in-depth looks at global cultures, religions, and social issues. Your support helps us continue creating content that bridges cultural gaps and promotes understanding. Don't forget to leave a comment sharing your thoughts or any questions you might have. Thanks for watching, and remember, knowledge is the first step towards understanding. See you in the next video. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.